Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Let's talk about IDORs, shall we? My favorite vulnerability type. What are they? How can we test for them? And also, first and second order IDORs. Have you ever heard about those? Let's get right into it, shall we? First of all, what is an IDOR? Because in essence, an IDOR is a really simple vulnerability. It's an insecure direct object reference, meaning it's a broken access control with a direct object reference. Now, those two might seem obscure, so let's dive a little bit deeper into them. But first, what you have to know is that IDOR is a search that was popularized by OWASP Top 10. It's not actually a specific vulnerability class in and of itself because of that broken access control plus that direct object reference. It's basically a broken access control issue. So if people talk about IDORs, keep in mind it's a broken access control. Not really super important, but good to know. To exist, an IDOR has to meet the following conditions. This is really important because if they don't meet, then it's not an IDOR, but you're talking about a different vulnerability type or none at all. So for an IDOR, you have to have an identifier somewhere in the request. It can be in the body, it can be in the URL itself, it can be in different places, but you also have to have your broken access control issue exist. Now, we're talking about, for example, these user identifiers here. It's really important that those exist in there, but it can be user identifier, address identifier, invoice identifier, order identifier. It can be a heap of different things. And that's really important for later on, because if we want to go automate that stuff, of course, we cannot automatically replace every single identifier in the program if they are named differently. That's going to be very difficult, but we'll talk more about that later. So an example I have for you guys is, for example, this get call here is going to invoice.php. And it's requesting an identifier of 12. So it's requesting basically the invoice number 12. And we can play around with that idea, of course, but one big tip I want to give you guys: if you're testing in a production environment, please don't mess around with random data, but do create 2 accounts and change the identifiers to the account that you own. It's really, really important that you don't just go screwing out with random data. You're a production environment. You are not allowed to read everybody's data. Even if you're a bug bounty hunter, it's not cool, and the programs, they don't like it. So another example I can give you guys is this post call here going to personalinformation.php. So you're updating your personal information, in this case your name, and it's going to update the name of the person ID 23. So that's important again to know that this person ID can be in the body, it can be in the URL, or it can be a literal reference to an item, for example. This can be a text file, or it can be a PDF file. It can be anything, but it can also just be part of the URL. So this .txt might not be there, and then it's also going to be valid. It's also going to get the invoice on 1234. That's called URL rewriting. So if you want to look that up, that's also a possibility, not part of this course. For our attack strategy, we can do manual testing or automated testing. If you're first starting out, I always recommend people to do manual testing first. It's really important to understand your tools before you actually get to work with them and before you actually get to deep dive into what you can do. So what we have at our disposal is we need identifiers. I already told you guys several places where you can find identifiers. You can find them in the URL, for example. So then you can just copy and paste the URL. You can log in as one user. You can go to your object, like your invoice. You can open it. You can copy your URL. You can log in as a different user and you can paste that URL. See if you can get the invoice of a different user. Really simple way of testing. The most simple one, I'd say, but also the most effective one to start out with. Now, if you have your identifier in the body, that's not going to be possible. So what we need to do then is we're going to replace those authentication headers in burp repeater. We're going to right click on our request, we're going to send it to burp repeater, and we're going to replace the authorization headers with a different user. That's also a possibility. And we can also execute JavaScript in the developer console. This is a pretty good one. I really like this one because it's really easy to test for IDORs. Not all programs have this possibility. Really important to understand. But if your program has, for example, a JavaScript function, get invoice, open parentheses, 1, 2, 3, 4, close parentheses, then you can try executing that specific function in the JavaScript console on an invoice that you don't own. And that's also IDOR testing. Now for a deep dive, I'm going to explain you guys a couple of bug bounty targets that you can explain in the wild and how you can test them, what you should test for IDORs on them, because as you go through different applications, you are going to see that not all applications allow for the same way of testing. This is very important to know. So for IDORs, when we go over the webshop testing, you have probably encountered this already. If you go over to a webshop, you might be thinking, okay, Uncle Red, what do I test for? Well, when it comes to IDOR, you're going to test all of these progresses, like buying an item, returning an item, the subscriptions, whatever is available, you're going to test it, because everywhere that you see an identifier, you're going to have the chance to test for different things. An example that I can give you, and that's going to be a second order IDOR, which we'll talk about later on. But say, for example, you're filling out your details and you're generating an invoice for a product that you've bought. On that invoice, when you want to generate it, you need to make a post request to the /generate invoice endpoint. That's going to be okay. So we have our /generate invoice endpoint. Excuse my handwriting, by the way. Generate invoice. This is our endpoint. And to get that, we need to make a post call to that specific endpoint. But in our body, we need to have our address ID. And now you might be thinking, okay, Uncle Red, how can I mess with this when I only have my address ID? Well, if you start changing the address ID in here, if you change it from 12 to 13, your invoice might be generated with a different address. And that's a way to get the address still. It's still a possibility to get somebody else's address. While if you go to the /getAddress endpoint, you might not be able to see that address because this one is properly secure. But getting an address on an invoice, that's the system getting the address, not you. So the invoice might still be generated. So be wary, test every single functionality. The game, if you are testing games, there are certain games like InnoGames on Integrity, for example, really good program. You should test for IDORs between the users if there's a possibility, of course. It's going to be a little bit harder sometimes. Some programs tend to obfuscate their traffic, so you might have to do some more research on that. But IDORs between users is a good one for that. Now, these are my favorite types of programs. I prefer these. And if you go for business-to-business applications, then I'm talking about invoicing programs. I'm talking about HR programs, CRM, everything that you can think of that's business-to-business related. If they have same tenant policy, and what I mean by a same tenant policy is that if you're a customer and I am a customer, we get hosted on the exact same network infrastructure and there's no separation of customers. That's a possibility these days. It's also a possibility to keep all of the customers separate. It's a preference, it depends. Look at your target. If the URL is the same URL that everybody else uses, then you know that you're using a same tenant policy. If the URL appears to be different, then you know that you're using a non-same tenant policy. So let's talk about the same tenant policy first. There's a possibility that you can or cannot create sub-accounts. We'll look a little bit into that later, but if you can't create sub-accounts, you should test for IDORs between users of the same tenant. Really important, also test for IDORs between tenants. and IDORs between tenants here, that one is going to be a big one. This one is going to be important because those ones are going to be much more impactful. They will allow for company espionage. If I can grab data from your company, that's going to be a much bigger problem than if one of my employees can get some data from another employee, of course, unless it's personal identifiable information, which in Europe is a pretty big deal. We have GDPR here, so that's going to be a bigger deal. But if it's like a product or something like that, that's not going to matter as much. And if you can create those sub-accounts, you can also test for IDORs between the sub-accounts. Now, what I mean by that will become much more apparent later. If you have a non-same tenant policy, and if you can't create sub-accounts, IDORs between users of the same account should be tested. And if you can't create sub-accounts, you should also test for IDORs between sub-accounts. Now, as for your attack strategy, if you have, for example, this is what I was talking about, a same tenant policy where you can create users with sub-accounts. For example, theme parks, we have Six Flags here, and then we have Six Flags Belgium and Six Flags New Jersey, which is spelled wrong. And then you also have Disneyland and Disneyland California and Disneyland Anaheim. So these are different companies, and as you can see, there are many different testings of IDORs going on between those. You have your IDORs between these sub-accounts, you have your IDORs between these accounts, and then you also have your IDORs between the main account and one of the sub-accounts. And one could also argue that you should test for IDORs between two main accounts. It depends if you can create users on those main accounts or not. Of course, if you cannot create users here, this and this will be obsolete. But if I can create a user here, if I can create user 1 here and user 1 in here, then I should also, of course, test for IDORs between these two. Now, as you can see, that's a whole lot of IDORs, and if you don't allow for sub-accounts, by the way, you should test for IDORs between user 1 and user 2, like this, and you should test between the different companies. So very important, just ignore this. This will be fixed in the final PDF. By the way, this should be like so, IDORs between user 1 and user 2. That's a whole lot of IDORs, don't you agree? And that's why IDOR is my favorite attack option. It's so in-depth, it's so amazing. There's so many things you can test for as well, because if you want to test all of the functionality, you're talking about all the CRUD actions as well. Create, read, update, delete. You're going to have to test all of those, except for create, of course, that's not possible. But you're going to have to test for quite a lot of things in quite a lot of different ways. And that's going to be very, very confusing, because sometimes you can even have guest accounts. And that's when it gets even more confusing. If I have a guest account on my Disneyland here, for example, if there is an accountant, an external accountant, and he wants to look into my Disneyland information here, I'm going to have to give him a guest account. Why not test for IDORs on the guest account as well? You know, it might be different functionality and logic and reasoning. So a lot of different ways you can test for IDORs. And then there's also the first versus second order IDORs, and those are really, really cool. I'm going to give you guys some examples, because otherwise it's going to be very hard to explain. I already gave you one before. For example, you make a GET request to the /receipt endpoint, and you're including your identifier. And when you do that, it might redirect you to /success or to /error if you make an unauthorized call. Now, if you make that call with your burp intruder, with your burp, I don't mean intruder, of course, with your burp interrupter, you're going to be able to follow the redirection. And if you make a request to the 4566 receipt, well, that's not yours, you can also navigate to /success instead of /error instead of the when you are inside of the burp intercept. So that's also a possibility, and then you might get shown a receipt that's not yours. You might be able to import products and then overwrite existing ones that you might not have the rights to write items to. You might be able to export products and see products that are not your own by printing them. You might be able to make a label for a certain product that's not yours. So there are so many different possibilities, like including addresses on your own invoice that aren't yours. There's tons of stuff that you can do, but you have to dig deep, and it's not going to be easy to find. So good luck. I'll see you in the next video. Bye, amazing hacker.